All right, welcome back, everybody. I'm going to talk today about Immanuel Kant, and you see, I've got some old lecture notes up here. In fact, these were originally 5 distinct lectures. I'm going to distill them down right now into a single lecture. So, I guess we can call these notes for old Kant lectures. In fact, these old Kant lectures, you can still find them. They are up on YouTube if you're interested. But I'm going to, I think, improve upon those right now. And I think one way in which this will be a bit better is that you can actually see my notes, which I think will be helpful for you as you listen. Okay, so Immanuel Kant, first of all, one of the very most influential philosophers in the whole history of Western philosophy. He probably gets my vote for sort of most important philosopher since the ancient Greeks. So that's a pretty big deal. Hugely influential in all sorts of areas of philosophy. We are going to focus on his ethical philosophy, of course, since that's our present unit. Um, you should know straight away, I think, that Kant is difficult to read. So, unfortunately, this seems to be a pattern that you may have already noticed. Lots of the very most important philosophers are not so easy to read. And Kant is maybe sort of the paradigmatic case of this. Hugely important, hugely influential, but his language is not at all easy. Part of the explanation for this is that he was writing in German in sort of the 18th century, mid to late 18th century, and at that time, German had really not been used as a language of philosophy. And so he was kind of pressing his native language into service as a language of philosophy, trying to talk about classical concepts that had been developed in Latin or in French or even in Greek. And he was sort of struggling to fit his German to this already established conceptual framework of Western philosophy. Add to that he was coming up with all sorts of new ideas himself, and you find that his language is really, really quite difficult to read. There are German students who read Kant who read him in English because his German is so difficult. So, obviously, I don't want you to sweat too much over this. We're really just focusing on a small part of Kant's philosophy here, Kant's ethical philosophy. And our main source text is going to be a book called The Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. And even then, we're just looking at really just the very beginning of this. This book, Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, is actually quite short, at least as philosophy books go. And it is preparatory to a second work called, in fact, The Metaphysics of Morals. Okay, and The Metaphysics of Morals, this is, by contrast, a huge tome of ethical philosophy, and it's really hardly ever read by people unless you're talking about experts on Kant, right? So Kant scholars will certainly read this book, but for many people trained in philosophy, and I am no exception, whereas The Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals is sort of a classic, everybody reads it kind of book, the Metaphysics of Morals itself is far less studied among philosophers. Okay, so what do we want to say about Kant's philosophy? Well, let's start with a few sort of simple ideas, and these 4 parts here, these are going to shape the beginnings of our lecture here. First of all, Kant's ethical philosophy is often called a deontological philosophy. Okay, so we're going to explain what that means. Kant famously says that the only thing that's good in and of itself is a good will. Okay. This is obviously in contrast with what we saw from John Stuart Mill, and so we're going to want to explain that. Kant further has some ideas about the end, the natural end of humanity, and he also has some things to say about the nature of a good will, as he should, right? He's actually got a lot to say about the nature of goodwill, because this this is really, in many ways, the heart of his ethical philosophy here. Okay, so let's start with the idea of deontology. Okay, deontology. The main thing to do, first of all, is to contrast this with consequentialism. You'll recall that consequentialism is associated with the work of John Stuart Mill, not that he would have used that term. But whereas the consequentialist says, hey, ethics is about producing the right kinds of consequences, the deontologist denies this. Okay? And so in particular, we could describe the deontological view by saying that, according to the deontologist, there are constraints on maximizing the good. Right? That is, the deontologist would say, hey, whenever you have to make an action, right? And of course, this is really basically any moment of our lives, at least any moment while we're awake. Consider all the actions available to you. Some actions will produce, such and such set of consequences. Other actions will produce different sets of consequences. The consequentialist says, well, hey, just figure out which one produces the best consequences and do that. Okay? And that seems, I think, eminently reasonable. And so some people see a paradox here when the deontologist says, no, actually there are situations in which the right thing to do is something other than the action that produces the best consequences. Okay. You can sort of imagine various cases like this, at least various plausible cases like this. Obviously, the consequentialist will deny this, but you might consider cases where, say, doing such and such could produce a lot of happiness, but maybe the happiness comes at the expense of, some innocent creature or something like that. Or, the thing that would produce the most happiness is to give me all of the chocolate, but that doesn't seem to be fair, right? Or maybe the thing that would produce the most happiness is if everybody contributes equally to the common good, right? But maybe if I'm forcing other people to do that, maybe that violates somebody's rights or something like that. Okay, so there are a lot of sort of prima facie natural intuitive ideas that you can use to kind of justify this idea that there are actually constraints on maximizing the good. Right? So the deontologist is going to say to the consequentialist, hey, happiness, yeah, that's probably important, but what about things like respecting human rights or being fair or, the fact that I made some promise to do something? Right? These things seem to matter too. And in the cases of those things, it's not apparently a matter of maximizing the good. It's just that these things, these ideas of rights or personal obligations or the commitments that promises make, right? These things just seem to trump any idea of maximizing good, right? If I come to my friend after having broken my promise to her and say, hey, I'm sorry, I didn't pick you up at the airport like I said I would, but this other opportunity came along and it was just way too pleasurable. I had to do that. The consequentialist and the deontologist can agree, right? That maybe they might agree anyway that whatever I did instead of picking my friend up, going to the whatever, the rave or the orgy or whatever it was, that maybe produced the most pleasure. But the deontologist would say, but my friend seems totally justified in saying, but you promised me that you would pick me up. Right? And that promise seems to matter, morally speaking, and it seems to be in some ways more important than my sort of weighing out of pleasures and pains. Okay, so this is sort of the basic idea. We're going to get into the details of Kant's view in a moment, of course. Deontology itself, right, is just, for now, just a kind of rejection of this consequentialist thesis that acting morally is only ever a matter of producing the best consequences. Kant, in fact, famously denies that happiness is intrinsically good, the way that Mill had described happiness. And you can think about this in the following sort of way. Well, happiness actually seems bad in certain cases. It seems perverse in certain cases. But there are people who get happy, pulling wings off flies, or worse. There are people who get happy, torturing animals or children or something like that. Right? And it doesn't seem like the happiness of the sadist counts in favor of the sadistic actions. Right? If you consider some horrible action that somebody's doing, and you say, well, the good news is that he's taking great pleasure in his torture, right? That doesn't seem to justify that action at all. In fact, if anything, it seems to make it worse, right? And you can say similar things about, say, intelligence, right? Is intelligence a good thing? Well, often it's a good thing. Often it's a good thing. But if you consider, which is worse, the intelligent criminal or the stupid criminal, well, the intelligent criminal seems to be by far the bigger threat, by far the bigger problem, right? By far the worse thing. And in fact, it seems to be because of the intelligence, right? If the intelligence of the criminal helps him to, get away with more things or hide more easily or trick more people or whatever, well, then so much the worse for that person and that person's actions. Okay. So happiness seems bad in certain cases. Intelligence seems bad in certain cases. Kant says basically anything can seem bad when you combine it with ill will. Right? That is, if my intentions are bad, right, then my bad intentions combined with my happiness is going to make the happiness seem bad. The happiness itself seem bad. My bad intentions together with my high intelligence is going to make the high intelligence itself seem bad. And inasmuch as that's true, that means that things like happiness and intelligence can't be intrinsically good, because if they were intrinsically good, they would be good everywhere, always, no matter what. Okay. Kant goes on to say that he's harping a bit on happiness because lots of people have put forth this idea that ethics is about happiness. And Kant says, happiness can hardly be our sort of natural end. We can't be sort of naturally suited to attain happiness because we're not very good at getting it, right? We don't seem to achieve it with any ease. It seems to be rather difficult, and we don't seem to do it naturally. And, this is sort of a sad fact, I guess, but if you think about lots of people in the world, lots of people struggle to be happy, right? And so it doesn't seem to come naturally to us. It doesn't, therefore, seem like it could really be the end of everything. But Kant says, let's think for a moment about what we do have naturally. What we do have naturally is a capacity for practical reason. And by practical reason, right, he and philosophers just mean a capacity for acting according to reasons, right? Acting on reasons, acting with motivations. Contrast the way that a human being can choose to do certain things with, the way that, I don't know, a kite moves in the wind, or the way that a pendulum swings back and forth, right? These things are moving, but they're not acting, right? Because acting means moving with purpose. Okay, and this very possibility for human beings that we can act with purpose, this seems to be precisely what is responsible for ethics in the first place, right? If I weren't responsible for my own actions, it wouldn't really make a lot of sense to think about ethics at all, right? Why is it that we can talk about which actions are good and which actions are bad? Well, because we have the capacity to choose which reasons we act on, right? Now that doesn't mean that, we're sort of infallible at choosing good reasons and acting on reasons that we intellectually justify and so on. Sometimes we act out of weakness, sometimes we act out of anger, sometimes we act out of love or lust or other emotions. But nevertheless, we have this capacity for acting with reason. And so Kant says that's really the thing that seems relevant most of all to a theory of ethics. And so perhaps morality should be about using our reason to achieve or to shape a good will. Right? Ethics might be about using our reason, our practical reason, in the proper sort of way. Practical reason, by the way, this is often contrasted with theoretical or speculative reason. Right? Theoretical or speculative reason, this is when you're reasoning about things just sort of in the abstract. Right? So you might do math proofs in your head or something like this. This is reasoning theoretically. Practical reason is about reasoning about what to do. Right? How am I going to act? Okay, so let's now think about what a good will consists in. Okay. Well, this is the big idea here, and what Kant says is a good will is a will that always acts from duty. Okay. From duty, that is, acting in obligation to some set of rules. Okay, and in particular, not only is ethics about following some set of rules, but it's about taking that as one's motivation. Right? Now this is very different from what we saw in Mill, because Kant is now addressing what our motivation ought to be. Right? We're talking about practical reason, we're talking about acting on reasons. Well, he's now telling us, right, here, this seems to be the reason that you ought to have when you act at all, following the moral law. Right? In other words, to put it in a more sort of homey way, doing the right thing because it's the right thing. Okay? Not because you expect some reward, not because you're afraid of the consequences of not doing so. And moreover, and more sort of controversially, not out of love, not out of sympathy, right? But because it's the right thing to do. Okay. Now, why is it that acting on on the passion, on the emotion of love, or acting on the emotion of sympathy, why is that bad, or why is that not a fully moral action? Notice I am hedging here a bit, right? So Kant presumably wouldn't say that it's a terrible thing to act, on the feeling of love, but he does say, but it's not sort of a completely full moral act if you're acting on love. And the way to get at this is to think about Kant's understanding of free action. Free action. What is it to act freely? Well, Kant says, look, actions are free when they're done without interference from emotions or inclinations. Okay? Actions are free when they're done without interference from emotions. If my anger causes me to lash out at you, right? If my sympathy causes me to invite you into my house, right? Well, to some extent, I'm letting my emotions take over my decision making, right? Whereas, lots of philosophers, many philosophers before Kant, in fact, this is sort of a dominant theme in ancient Greek philosophy too, right? The idea is, well, wait a minute, I'm in charge of my actions. My reasoning capacity ought to be in charge of what I do, not my emotions, right? I don't. There are many times when, I've acted on anger, and then I regretted it later, right? I thought about it later, and I came to the conclusion that letting anger rule my body was a mistake, right? I didn't really mean that when I did it, right? It wasn't really even me in a way, right? It was this demon of anger that had sort of overtaken me, right? And to some extent, I was a slave to that anger, or to that lust, or to that sadness, or to that grief, or whatever it was, right? The emotions aren't sort of, as it were, proper drivers of our bodies. When we are thinking about how to act, right, we ought to be responsive to reasons. And Kant is telling us the only reason that matters is obedience to the moral law, right? And so if you're acting out of love, much less acting out of anger or fear or something like that, you're not really quite doing the thing that you should be doing, right? Because it's your motivational set that really matters. And the proper motivation for moral action is, I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. Okay, so we have Kant's, the beginning of Kant's view is starting to take shape now, and we can think about a narrower sense of the term deontology. And in fact, this is really what deontological ethics is all about. The deontologist says that ethics is about acting in accordance with some set of rules. Okay, some set of rules. And in fact, this word deontology comes from Greek words that really just mean the study of what ought to be done. Right? So things that ought to be done, some set of rules. Okay, notice, right, we have clearly arrived at a view that's different from the consequentialist view, because the consequentialist says, well, just do whatever produces the best consequences. Right? We can't sort of formulate any general rules because every situation will be different. In some situations, going to the party will produce the most happiness. In other circumstances, I don't know, calling your mother will produce the best sorts of consequences. There is no sort of set of rules that we can describe here for ethical action. But the deontologist, Kant, is saying, no. We need rules because the whole point of having a moral motivation is to be acting in accord with some set of rules. Okay, now we've reached sort of the heart of the beginning of the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals in many ways, because now the question is, okay, what are those moral rules, right? What is the content of those laws? Notice, for example, a traditional Orthodox Christian is a deontologist of a kind, right? Because the Christian, the Orthodox Christian says, yes, that's right. Ethics is about following rules, right? Maybe things like the Ten Commandments. That's obviously a simplification. There are a lot more laws in Leviticus and other parts of the Bible and so on, but you might sort of take the Ten Commandments as, right, one moral code, right? Morality is about following those 10 commandments. Is there anything in those 10 commandments about maximizing happiness? No, right? Could it be that by following those 10 commandments, you would fail to produce the maximum happiness at every opportunity? Yeah, in fact, it's probably quite likely that you would fail to produce maximum happiness by following the 10 commandments, right? I think most people are well aware that breaking the 10 commandments can be a lot of fun. But the idea here is that it is these rules, right? It is the inclination to follow these rules that counts. And happiness is really not of the issue at all. Um, but Kant doesn't say the content of the moral rules is determined by the Christian God and so on. Kant does something different here. It's a very striking way of generating a deontological view without any sort of dependence on God or anything like that at all. Excuse me. So, what Kant says is this. He says, well, look, if we're going to figure out what these moral laws are, we have to have laws that abstract away from anything that's not intrinsically good, right? So the laws can't be things like go maximize happiness, right? There's a jab to Mill. It can't be go maximize happiness because happiness isn't intrinsically good. It's not always good to maximize happiness. Right? It can't be a thing like go sort of promote intelligence because intelligence isn't always good. And you'll recall from earlier, right? We said take just about anything, right? Almost anything seems bad when you combine it with ill will, right? So Kant's lesson now, a bit deeper on, is well, if we've sort of thrown out everything, right? If we've thrown out everything that could make up the content of our moral laws, our moral rules, our moral code, right? If it can't be anything about happiness or anything about intelligence or about love or about, it can't be about any of those things, Kant says what remains is the bare formal notion of a law itself. Right? What remains is just the notion of a law, contentless, as it were. And we have sort of the form of a law, but no real content. But Kant explains this in the following way. He says, well, what that means is, right, what this result is to which we've come, this idea that there's nothing remaining that could make up the content of our moral laws except the bare notion of a law, that means that we must act in such a way that we can will the maxim of our action to be a universal law of nature. This is Kant's theory in one line. We must act in such a way that we can rationally will the maxim of our action to be a universal law of nature. What is the maxim of our action? Well, it's just the principle of my action. It explains my circumstances, it explains my motivational set, it explains my goals, right? So a maxim would be something like, in circumstances C, I am going to choose to do blah, 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 with the goals of blah, 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 right? So it's just a kind of principle written out that explains my action, explains the subjective nature of my will at this moment, okay? And the idea is that thing, right, however it is that I'm describing my action to myself, that thing has to be law-like in the sense that I have to be capable of willing it as a universal law. Right? If I'm unwilling to treat it as a universal law, right, then that means that that action that I'm considering couldn't possibly be a moral action. And so this invites a kind of test. Okay? And you can think about it like this. Would I be willing to live in a world in which my action is law? That is, try to imagine a world in which everyone is acting in the way in which I'm proposing to act. Okay? If I'm fine with that, if I want that, if I will that, if I can will that, then my action is moral. Okay? If not, my action is immoral. Notice again, very, very different from what we saw in Mill. Here, the only thing that really matters as far as measuring the morality of my action is what is my will about it, right? What is the quality of my will? What are my intentions? Right? It's my intentions that matter. Nothing here about happiness. Nothing here about producing consequences. But just, is the thing that I'm trying to do the sort of thing that could be made law, right? So, famous example here, suppose there's a man in debt and this guy really needs money badly, and he's considering saying to a friend, hey, loan me some money, I promise to repay you, um, when in fact he has no such intention of repaying her at all, only wants to have some money for some immediate gratification. Okay. Okay, so consider this, right? The question then is, could that man rationally will that his maximum be universal law? Right? So the maximum would be something like, whenever I'm in terrible financial trouble, I'm going to uh, lie to my friend, promise to repay my friend uh, for loaning me some money so that I can benefit from that money and not have to be burdened by paying it back, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Can I will that as a universal law? And Kant's answer is, and I think this is pretty clearly the right answer, no. You can't really rationally will that, right? Because if you tried to will that, you would in effect be willing the destruction of the whole enterprise of promise making, right? Could I will that everybody, when they want something badly enough, will say they promise to do something, but have no such intention of fulfilling that promise? That's a terrible, a terrible world to live in, right? That would sort of destroy promise making. It would probably destroy communication more generally, right? If I can't sort of rely on people to follow their word, then I'm going to stop talking to people, right? And a world in which everybody stops talking to people is a pretty terrible world. Okay, so that's sort of the key idea of Kant's theory. Take the maximum of your action, the thing that the description of your action, description of your intentions in a particular set of circumstances. Try to imagine that everyone does that thing when they're in the situation that you're in. If you're willing to live in such a world, your action passes the test and it's moral. If it doesn't, then it doesn't pass the test and it's not moral. This claim of Kant, this theory of Kant's, is sometimes called the theory of the categorical imperative. Okay, so you'll hear philosophers sometimes talk about Kant's categorical imperative. And the idea that they mean here, that Kant talks about, is something that commands us categorically is something that commands us unconditionally. Kant says the idea of morality is that reason makes demands upon us, right? And those reasons are independent of anybody's particular circumstances or motivations or social status or whatever. Right? All of those things, all of those particular idiosyncratic features of us, those things Kant has ruled out as being relevant to morality because they can't be a matter of anything that's intrinsically good. Okay. This is supposed to be contrasted with conditional imperatives, or if you like, what Kant's term is, hypothetical imperatives. So this is illustrated most easily, I think, with an example. Suppose that I have an obligation to be, I told somebody that to be in California tomorrow, and the last plane leaves here in just a few minutes, right? Well, in that circumstance, it seems like I have an obligation, an imperative, to get on that plane so that I can be in California tomorrow, right? But that imperative, that obligation, is dependent upon, right? It has as a condition or a hypothesis or a previous conditioning factor this idea that I've made some obligation to be in California tomorrow. right? So I may have some obligation to get on this plane now, but only on the condition that I have this commitment to be in California. Okay. By contrast, moral rules are supposed to command us categorically, right? Without any conditional hypothesis at all. Moral rules are supposed to be, in this sense, absolute. Okay. Um, Most famously, I think Kant says that many moral rules will be absolute. Even a prohibition on lying will be absolute. Lying, it's pretty hard to imagine how a lie could pass this universalizability test. It seems to be the sort of thing that will always fail. And so, therefore, lying in Kant's eyes must be always wrong. Okay. And I think that is, pretty surprising. Most of us lie, fairly often. I'll just speak for myself. I lie fairly often, right? And I don't necessarily have any ethical qualms about it. I might tell the guy on the street that I don't have any spare change. I might tell someone I don't really want to see that I'm busy tonight and can't hang out, and then go watch, 3 hours of Survivor or whatever. Right? I lie, and I don't think that I'm necessarily doing anything wrong. But Kant is telling us here, right? Lying by its very nature is going to fail this task of universalization, and so it will always be wrong, right? And I think he's quite right that I can't really desire that I live in a world where everybody's lying all the time, right? Once again, that just wouldn't make for much of a society at all if nobody could trust anybody else. Okay. Famous illustration of this general prohibition on lying. The scenario is there's a murderer at the door. Okay, you're hiding someone in your house. Angry mob comes to your door. They're clearly looking to kill that person who's hiding in your house. The mob asks you if you've seen that person. Now, I think most of us would be inclined to lie in this case, especially if we have any regard for the person hiding in our house at all. And we'd say, nope, haven't seen him, keep moving, angry mob who's going to do terrible things. But Kant's saying now we can't lie, right? If Kant's view is really right, it would be morally wrong for me to lie to the mob, even though I can foresee that the mob might do terrible things to this person who's hiding. Okay. This objection was raised during Kant's lifetime. Someone wrote up this sort of objection and said, hey, here's a case where I'm lying, but I'm lying for sort of altruistic reasons. I'm lying because I care about this person who's hiding in my house. I don't want him to just be devoured by the mob. Surely it's not wrong of me to lie to the angry mob. And of course, Kant, predictably enough, I guess, publishes his response to this article that was written, and he sticks to his guns, and he says, no, I know it seems like it's okay to lie to this mob, but really it's still wrong. And he brings up another way of thinking about his ethical theory, which is that you ought to act so that you always treat people as ends in themselves. Treat people as ends in themselves, not in particular as means to your own ends. Right? That is, not merely as means to your own ends. Okay. So we do use people as means unproblematically, pretty regularly, right? If I go to the grocery store and I'm sending my items over the scanner with the cashier, or the cashier is maybe scanning my items, right? Well, there's a sense in which I'm using that cashier for my own end of, walking away with my new groceries, right? But the real idea here is that I'm not merely treating the cashier as a means to my own end, right? I can use the cashier to help me finish my transaction at the grocery store, but I can't just sort of, slap her around or yell at her or abuse her in any way while I'm using her as a means to my end, right? I have to respect her as an end in herself. Famously, right, Kant says this idea of acting so that you always treat people as ends in themselves and never merely as means, Kant says this is just another way of putting the same theory that we outlined above here, that we ought to act in such a way that we can rationally will the maximum of our action to be universal law. Right? He says these two principles actually amount to the same thing. They're two ways of putting the very same ethical theory. This is obviously far from obvious. There's been a lot of discussion in Kantian literature about whether we can sort of make this out. Does this make any sense? But just know that this is another way of thinking about Kant's moral theory, acts that you can always treat people as ends in themselves. This way, I think, of putting the Kantian theory helps to understand Kant's reaction to this story about the murderer at the door. Whenever I lie, right, that necessarily involves treating someone as a means to my own ends. And as such, it's wrong. Right? If I lie to you, if I deceive you, right, well, then I'm using you, right? I'm keeping the truth from you. I'm using you so that I can achieve some further end. Right? If I lie to the person I don't want to see and say I'm busy tonight, I'm using that person, right? Using that person as a means to my own end of not having to deal with that person and doing whatever I want. Okay. And I'm not also treating that person as an end in himself, because if I were, right, I would be respecting that person. I would say that's another human being out there who has his own ends and his own goals and so on, and I am totally thwarting his goals by giving him a false picture of the world. Right? I'm lying about my current situation, and so I'm using him. And that seems to be true even when I'm talking to the murderous mob at the door, right? If I just say, nope, I haven't seen that person, I'm using those people in the mob as a means to my own end of protecting that person who's hiding in my house. Okay. I think that's way more than enough for now, but that's Kant's theory in a nutshell. Very, very different from Mill's view. Some of the key things to keep in mind. Kant's theory is deontological, meaning that he thinks morality is about following a certain set of laws or rules. And in particular, right after some fussing about what the content of these rules is going to be, he says, well, really it's just about being able to think of your action as a law. Right? Can I will that I live in a world where everybody's acting the way that I act? As though it were a law, right? If everybody were doing it, if they were just following it as a law of nature, the way that everybody, is controlled by gravity, right? If I can imagine such a world and embrace it and say, yes, that's the kind of world I want to be in, then my action passes the test, and if not, then my action is immoral. Okay, that's it for now. Thanks very much, everybody, and see you next time.